The story of Frank Matthews does not begin with his disappearance, even though that is what people remember. It begins long before the mystery, in a time when the rules of the drug trade were already written, controlled, and enforced by systems that had existed for decades. Matthews did not enter that world to follow those rules. He entered it to quietly study them, understand them, and eventually break them in a way that would change how the game was played. Born in Durham, North Carolina, he grew up in an environment where opportunities were limited and survival was often the only immediate goal. But Matthews was not driven by survival alone. He was driven by something more calculated, something that pushed him to look beyond the surface of things. Where others saw daily struggles, he saw systems. Where others saw limits, he saw inefficiencies. That way of thinking would eventually define everything he became. When he arrived in Harlem, the streets were already active with heroin distribution networks that stretched across neighborhoods and into other states. The structure was clear. Suppliers controlled the product, middlemen distributed it, and street-level dealers handled the final sales. Most people accepted this hierarchy because it worked, and because stepping outside of it came with serious consequences. Matthews did not accept it. He observed it carefully, learning how the product moved, how money flowed, and where the real power sat within that system. What he realized was simple but dangerous. The real money was not at the bottom, and it was not even in the middle. The real power came from controlling the source and the movement at the same time. If you could remove dependency on others and build your own pipeline, you could control everything. That idea became the foundation of his rise. Instead of relying on existing suppliers, Matthews established direct connections that allowed him to bypass traditional networks. This was not a small adjustment. It was a complete shift in how he operated. By cutting out intermediaries, he increased profits, reduced vulnerability, and created a system where he dictated the terms. This move alone placed him in a category that very few ever reached. He was no longer just participating in the drug trade. He was reshaping it. His operation expanded quickly, not in a chaotic way, but in a structured and deliberate manner. Distribution points were organized, workers had defined roles, and the flow of product was consistent. The organization functioned with a level of discipline that made it both efficient and difficult to disrupt. As his network grew, so did his reputation. Matthews became known not just in Harlem, but across multiple cities. His reach extended beyond New York, creating a network that connected different regions through a shared supply chain. The money followed that expansion. Large amounts moving steadily, creating a level of wealth that allowed him to live comfortably while still maintaining control over his operation. Unlike some figures who relied on visibility to establish dominance, Matthews balanced presence with discretion. He was known, but he was not reckless. He understood that attention could be both useful and dangerous, and he managed it carefully. At some point during his rise, he became part of conversations that went beyond individual operations. Meetings were held among major figures in the drug trade to discuss distribution, pricing, and territory. Matthews entered those spaces not as a subordinate, but as someone who had already proven his ability to operate independently. His presence in those discussions reflected the level he had reached. He was no longer just another name in the system. He was a force within it. That level of success inevitably drew attention from law enforcement. Agencies began to investigate, collecting information, building cases, and trying to understand the full scope of his operation. The more they looked, the more they realized that Matthews was not a small player. He was connected, organized, and operating at a scale that required a coordinated response. Surveillance increased, informants were used, evidence was gathered. Eventually, the system that had allowed him to rise began to close in. He was arrested and charged with serious offenses tied to his role in large-scale heroin distribution. The charges carried significant consequences, including the possibility of long-term imprisonment. For most people in his position, this would mark the beginning of the end. The process would move forward, leading to trial, conviction, and sentencing. But Matthews' story did not follow that path. After his arrest, he was released on bail, a decision that would later be seen as one of the most critical moments in the entire case. Being released on bail gave him something extremely valuable. It gave him time. Time to assess his situation, time to consider his options, and time to act. During this period, he remained under scrutiny, but he was not confined. He had the ability to move, to communicate, and to prepare. What happened next suggests that he used that time with a level of precision that had defined his entire career. Sometime before his scheduled court proceedings, Matthews disappeared. The disappearance was not chaotic or visible. It did not involve public confrontation or immediate pursuit. It was quiet, controlled, and executed in a way that left very little behind. He did not simply go into hiding within the same environment. He removed himself completely. Along with him, large amounts of money also vanished. Estimates suggest that he took millions in cash, money that had been accumulated through his operations. There were no clear financial trails, no obvious transactions that could be followed easily. The movement of that money indicated planning, suggesting that this was not a last-minute decision, but something prepared in advance. Law enforcement responded with urgency. The case shifted from prosecution to pursuit. Efforts were made to locate him across the country and eventually beyond it. Leads were followed, tips were investigated, and various theories were explored. Some suggested that he had left the United States, possibly moving to regions where he could blend in more easily. Others believed that he may have been assisted by connections developed during his time in the trade. There were also theories that he did not survive long after his disappearance, that the same world he had navigated successfully for years may have caught up with him once he was no longer protected by his structure and influence. Despite these efforts, no definitive answer was found. There was no confirmed arrest, no verified sighting that could be proven beyond doubt, and no recovery of the money that disappeared with him. Over time, the case became less about immediate resolution and more about the unanswered questions it left behind. Investigations continued, but the lack of concrete evidence made it increasingly difficult to reach a clear conclusion. The disappearance of Matthews had a direct impact on the organization he had built. Without his leadership, the structure began to weaken. Operations that had relied on centralized control became fragmented. Individuals within the network pursued their own interests, and the consistency that had defined the system was lost. While elements of the operation may have continued for a time, it no longer functioned as a unified entity. The absence of its central figure created a vacuum that could not be easily filled. Over the years, Matthews' story has been revisited repeatedly, not because of new evidence, but because of the uniqueness of his case. In a field where outcomes tend to follow predictable patterns, his stands out for its lack of closure. Most figures involved in similar activities are eventually located, whether through arrest or other means. His case does not provide that resolution. Instead, it remains open to interpretation, shaped by theories, speculation, and the limited information that exists. Some accounts suggest that he may have successfully established a new identity and lived quietly outside the reach of the authorities. Others argue that such an outcome would have required a level of support and coordination that would be difficult to maintain over time without exposure. There are also perspectives that question whether the lack of evidence is itself an indication of a different outcome, one that was never publicly documented. Each of these views attempts to explain the same absence of information from a different angle, but none can be confirmed with certainty. What remains clear is the impact he had during his time in the drug trade. His approach to building and managing his operation demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. By focusing on control of supply and distribution, he created a system that maximized efficiency and profitability. His ability to operate across multiple regions expanded his influence and established him as a significant figure within that environment. These elements of his story are supported by documented investigations and accounts from the period, even if the final chapter is not. The absence of a definitive ending has turned Matthews into a subject of ongoing discussion. His name is often mentioned in conversations about figures who managed to avoid the outcomes that others could not. Whether that perception is entirely accurate is difficult to determine, but the lack of closure contributes to its persistence. In the absence of confirmed facts, the narrative continues to evolve, shaped by the questions that remain unanswered. In the end, the story of Frank Matthews is defined as much by what is known as by what is not. It includes a rise built on strategic decisions, an operation that expanded beyond local boundaries, and a disappearance that has not been conclusively explained. It does not offer a clear resolution, and that lack of resolution is what distinguishes it from many others. The details that can be verified provide a foundation, but the unanswered questions ensure that the story continues to be revisited, examined, and debated long after the events themselves have passed.